Professor Michael Wesley.
It is a delight to be here this evening. I spent last week at the beach and I needed some time off, and when I was packing my bag, I packed two books. I packed this book and I packed the latest novel in a Chinese detective series that I've been looking forward to reading for a very long time. And I thought to myself, sorry about this, Gabrielle and Mike, I will, I guess, wade through this book and I will reward myself with reading large swathes of the latest Chu Xiaolong detective thriller. I ended up reading this book cover to cover, and I think I've just about got through the first chapter of Chu Xiaolong's book, which is probably going to be a fantastic book. But that is my way of saying that completely unexpectedly, I found this book very, very hard to put down. And I'm not saying that because I've been paid a large amount of money or because I just want to be nice. It was genuinely interesting. Because what it did was it made me start to think about some of my own intellectual interests and preoccupations in a completely different way. Lawrence said that uncertainty and risk is something that he's thought about regularly from a number of different perspectives. I probably should be embarrassed to say that I actually haven't thought about uncertainty very much in my own professional career. And it's an academic career in international relations and security studies, and also a professional stint working for an intelligence agency. Yes, I guess in some senses I was a spook, Lawrence, though I was analysing intelligence rather than collecting it. And yes, I had never really thought about uncertainty, and it really made me start to think about some familiar things in totally different ways. And that's why I found the entire book so compelling. I suppose, having made an introduction like that, I should start this presentation at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. I don't know how many people in this room have been to CIA headquarters, but it's quite an experience because it's a nice drive out from Washington along the banks of the Potomac River, and you come to the George H.W. Bush Center of Intelligence. They had to put the HW in there because it couldn't be the George W. Bush Center of Intelligence. And you go through the guard post with, you know, huge Marines and so on pointing guns in all directions, and you're taken into the main entrance hall of the CIA, the place where they receive people. And it's a big glittering foyer, and there is an inscription engraved into the wall in foot-high letters. And the inscription is a quotation from the Bible. From memory, it's John chapter 6, verse 24. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. It's a fascinating calling card, a motto, if you like, that the CIA has established for itself. Because it basically tells you what the CIA believes its mission is, how it relates to the rest of America, and how it relates to national security. First of all, the CIA is telling you that it is the part of government that can deliver the truth. It can deliver the truth to policymakers. And beyond that, that the truth, remember when the inscription was put on the wall, deep in the Cold War, that the truth will enable America to fight for freedom around the world, that the truth is necessary to national security. And the inscription flashed back into my mind because, of course, this is also a statement about certainty, uncertainty, and risk. America faces a whole lot of risks about which it is uncertain, and therefore it creates an intelligence agency and a variety of other national security agencies to help it manage those risks. It all fits together really nicely. And of course, the conclusion is therefore obvious. The next step that occurred to me as I gazed out at the waves and so on was that security and national security, in a sense, if you pare everything back, is about the manipulation of certainty and uncertainty. It's about how governments perceive certainty and uncertainty, and it's about the agencies that they set up to manipulate and to work with certainty and uncertainty. If you go to the psychological literature, you find studies that show with very early infants that the regulation of uncertainty is one of the earliest and most profound human motivations. Studies show that infants become, from the age of a couple of months, become deeply interested in contingent relations, contingency relations, in the confirmation or violation of expectations. And so many of the games we play with very young infants are around the themes of establishing contingency and certainty and tricking them with seeming uncertainty. When you think about it, certainty is a deeply enabling condition. When we are certain, we know what to do, we know what we want, and we know how to go and get it. On the other hand, uncertainty is profoundly disempowering. Uncertainty can lead to deception, deliberate deception by others. Uncertainty can lead to confusion, where we don't really know what we want and we don't really know how we can get there. If you expand the frame then to society and the state from the individual, you see that certainty and uncertainty are also basic to the operation of societies and to the viability of states. If you like to think about trust as one of the main things that holds a society such as ours together, that allows people to interact with a sense of safety, with a sense of certainty and surety, then you can think about that as horizontal trust, the trust that exists between citizens, the civility that makes a society work. And you can see that when societies begin to break down, they lose that sense of civility. They lose that sense of trust between people, the expectation of trust. That horizontal trust, if you like, depends on a prior vertical trust between citizens and their state. The trust that the citizens have that the state will enforce civility and will protect them from external attacks on their ways of being and their ways of life. So it's a rather old point that the trust that the state provides to its citizens enables the trust to develop between them. Because once that trust, that vertical trust, evaporates, citizens start to stop trusting each other, and they start taking the enforcement and protection of themselves into their own hands, which leads directly to social breakdown. We've seen this dynamic so often in our own region. And so I think basically certainty and uncertainty are so central to the way we think about the state and our own security, as well as what I would like to argue, international security. Now, as Mike Smithson puts it in his chapter in the book, uncertainty occurs naturally. Uncertainty is everywhere. It's a fact of life. As Lawrence said, you cannot live in perfect certainty. It is impossible. No one has the ability to comprehend everything and comprehend the truth about everything available. But Mike Smithson points out that significant uncertainty, the uncertainty that matters to human beings, whether individually or in groups, is socially constructed. That we have expectations of certainty which makes certain types of uncertainty unacceptable. That we expect to be certain about certain things, and if we're not, that sets up an expectation, a socially constructed expectation. And if we think about national security in this way, there is an expectation then among citizens, the citizens of a state, that the government can provide and achieve certainty about citizens' safety, their future, their integrity and their welfare. These are things that we expect of our governments, and if we don't see our governments being able to provide some measure of certainty against these things, then of course we vote them out of office. So the government is expected to be able to eliminate sources of social uncertainty in relation to these values: safety, the future, integrity, welfare, and so on. And I would argue that the national security institutions of the state are at the very forefront of the government mechanisms for identifying and reducing threatening uncertainty about the outside world. What I'd like to suggest is that national security is basically a dynamic in which a state tries to establish the maximum possible certainty against adversaries for itself, while increasing the uncertainty of its adversaries. To go back to the psychological literature, there's an interesting concept in psychology that is called the locus of control. When someone is said to have an internal locus of control, they believe that they are very much in control of their own destiny, that they know what they want and they feel that they have the ability to go out and get what they want. When someone has an external locus of control, on the other hand, they feel that other people, other forces are controlling their life. That often they don't know what they want, and even when they do know what they want, they don't have the means. Other people, other forces control the means for what they want. So if we think about the state's security task in terms of a locus of control, the state, through its security institutions, tries to internalise as much as possible its own control over its own destiny, its own objectives and its own ability to achieve those objectives. And I would argue that the essence of national security and international security is identifying and trying to externalise as much as possible the locus of control of adversaries and those who threaten us. Now, I would argue that the central question that confronts national security agencies, and this is a question that is posed in a chapter in this book, is how do our national security agencies understand the world? By which I mean, how do they locate the certainties in the world, what they think they know about the world, and how do they perceive and order the uncertainties? I'm getting very close to Donald Rumsfeld here and known unknowns and unknown unknowns, but I think you know what I mean. And inherent in our ability to think about national security, inherent in our understanding of the usefulness of the state and its national security institutions, is our belief in their capacity to identify significant uncertainties and reduce those uncertainties while manipulating and externalising the uncertainties of those who threaten us and are our adversaries. It's therefore, what I would argue here is that certainty and uncertainty are central to the national security task which is basically a question of internalising and externalising locuses of control. The central question, however, that is posed by the chapter in this book is, does our national security agencies' picture of the world, where certainties and uncertainties are located, correspond to how the world actually is? Does it correspond to how the world has evolved? Are we looking for certainties and uncertainties in a world that has moved on and become threatening in different ways? And that's what I'd like to talk a little bit about tonight. My basic argument is that the nature of the national security task is changing. It is locating certainties and uncertainties in different places. And most importantly, what this book helped me understand is that the nature of uncertainty differs, and the consequences of different types of uncertainty are different. And what we expect from our national security agencies, therefore, differs. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. There are basically 4 questions that Michael Smithson poses in one of the opening chapters of the book. And I'm going to paraphrase here, Mike, because it kind of helps me understand. First question in thinking about uncertainty: what are the various types of uncertainty that are important to us in a national security sense? And he suggests that there are basically two basic types of uncertainty. One is distortion, and the other is incompleteness. I'll talk more about this in a few moments. Secondly, how are those uncertainties constituted or comprised? And he suggests 4 basic ways deriving out of the 2 basic types of uncertainty: inaccuracy, confusion, unawareness, and absence. Thirdly, what are the consequences of each type of uncertainty in national security terms? What will happen if we continue to be uncertain about these issues? Fourthly, what are our national security agencies expected to do about these uncertainties? What do we expect of them in relation to these? And Mike, I'm afraid I've added a 5th question, is how possible is certainty in relation, how possible is the achievement of certainty in relation to these uncertainties? What I'd like to suggest is that this helps us think about how security challenges have evolved. I would argue that security challenges are evolving from threats towards risks. By threats, I mean specific dangers that are measured on the basis of the capacity of an adversary to realise a hostile intent against us. By risks, I mean scenarios that are measured on the basis of the likelihood of an adverse occurrence happening. So how do these differ? Well, they differ across several variables. We counter threats in a very Clausewitzian way by seeking to affect the will and the capacity of our adversary to do something nasty to us. We counter risks by working either to preempt the scenario occurring or by building our own resilience against the consequences of the scenario. Against threats, our present actions are intended to produce future consequences. Conversely, with risks, anticipated consequences shape current actions. A good way to think about it is to think about global warming, to think about an intended consequence which we are using to shape our current actions. With threats, I would argue the national security focus is on our adversary's capacity and intent. When we think about risks in a national security context, we focus on the likelihood that a certain scenario will occur and the scale of damage that scenario will incur if it happens. I would argue that increasingly threats are being replaced by risks in developed democracies like Australia's national security priorities. And I think this has several causes and I'd like to throw three of them out on the table. Firstly, if you look at the incidence of major wars between states, these are in precipitous decline. We haven't seen major wars between great powers and certainly significant states for a very long time. And arguably this will decline over time. Secondly, as we become more safe and more prosperous, an interesting psychological phenomenon kicks in. There's an element of economic theory called prospect theory. And one of the things that prospect theory suggests is that the more you have, the less you're willing to risk. That the less you have, the more you're willing to risk to improve your position. I would argue that as we become safer and as we become more prosperous, we also become more risk averse. We become highly sensitive to risks that we really wouldn't have cared about 50 years ago or 60 years ago. And finally, I would argue that globalisation makes us highly attentive to risks, because globalisation pits two logics against each other. On the one hand, globalisation depends on the trust I was talking about stability, about people being confident increasingly that they can rely on ordered processes and ordered understandings and expectations far beyond their borders, but also within their borders. So on the one hand, globalisation is a process that is deeply dependent on a stable order. And I would argue that that stable order exists in the world today. But globalisation at the same time is a deeply destabilising process and a deeply disordering process. It thrives, it makes its major gains, its major prosperity on disorder and using disorder. And I would call it basically a creative disorder that it does. But also this creative disorder does empower actors that are below the level of the state, that have malevolent intent or that seek to make illicit gains from the processes of globalisation.